for coming to this incredible building. We will have a discussion, a panel discussion with our esteemed guests. We have Colin Grimes, who is a former deputy head teacher of a school in the town of Jinja. Sophie Kanabar, who came to this country from Uganda at the age of around 6. Sir Peter Salisbury, who is the city mayor. We also have Jasveer Singh, who is from the South Asian Heritage Month. And we also have Chandni Mistry, who is one of the writers of the plays. As you know, there are 3 plays. So today is quite an important day because it marks 50 years since Asians were told to leave Uganda by President Amin. He made that announcement 50 years ago, giving them 90 days to leave. His reason? Well, he said Asians were milking the economy. He said that Asians were not integrating with the indigenous African community. That was something that was strenuously denied by community leaders. We know that Idi Amin was a man not to be messed with, and when Asians were told to leave in 90 days, at first they didn't believe it, but they knew about his reputation because he was responsible for the deaths of between 300 and 500,000 people. And he was responsible for some horrific things in Uganda. We know that there was panic, there was chaos, there was bloodshed, there was a lot of kidnappings that went on. So it's really important that we don't forget what happened 50 years ago. So, as I said, there will be a play, 3 plays in fact, in just over an hour. But first of all, I'd like to introduce you to our guests. And first up to introduce himself is Colin Grimes. If you'd like to come up, Colin.
Thank you, Reggie. Thank you, Reggie. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share the memories of that horrible period with you, but it has to be faced. And unfortunately, if you look around the world now, perhaps we haven't learned quite so much, and there's equal problems going on, or almost equal problems going on. I'd like to think in terms of this afternoon, I can speak with an almost unique perspective because I was right in the middle of both the Asian, the African and the European situation in 1972. I want to explain that at age 27, with my wife Norma and 3 children, aged 7, 5 and 2, I first went out to Uganda and was appointed as a teacher at Kira College Butiki, which is about 10 miles outside of Jinja. But of course, we were immediately introduced to the Asian population because we had to go into Jinja for our shopping. And of course, most of the shops and the people we dealt with there were from the Asian community, and we very quickly struck up a lot of friends. For those of you who remember Jinja or have associations with them, I remember, for example, Jeff and George's as the 2 main grocers, but Kassam's Electrical Supplies, Anwar's and Kuna's Garages, Tatani's Furniture, now Sports House, Jinja Jewelers, Madalani's Hardware, Kina Bakery and so on, in addition to the many smaller enterprises such as tailors, barbers, shoemakers, butchers, bookshops and so on, that we all had to deal with in order to carry on our life. Very shortly after the end of the first year, the Amber Court Club in Jinja was reopened. Now, Amber Court Club had been built originally by the Uganda Electricity Board to give a social program for the expatriate builders of the Owen Falls Dam. It had been closed and fallen into disrepair, but by representations from the Asian community in Jinja, it was opened again in 1966. By this time, my wife had a job at Nyanza Textiles just across the Owen Falls Dam and had a friend who lived literally next door to the club. We became aware of its opening and we decided to apply for membership and were accepted. As I say, the membership was predominantly Asian, but there were perhaps 20 or 30 of us Europeans who joined in, were made very welcome, and as a result of that experience in that club over several years, we made some very, very close friends that have persisted, some of them even unto this day. At the end of 1967, at the end of my first tour, I was offered a second contract, this time down at Jinja Senior Secondary School in the heart of Jinja. And since it saved me about 40 miles a day driving up and down to between Nyanza Textiles and the schools where my children were, I decided that this would be very convenient. Ginger Senior Secondary School had been the Ginger Asian Secondary School, and it had a 4-stream intake. By 1967, it had changed its name to Ginger Senior Secondary School and had a 14-stream intake with 2,000 students. It was the biggest day school in East Africa. We had 1,000 students in the morning, leading up to A-levels, and we had the junior school 1,000 students in the afternoon. About a third of those students were Asians, the rest of them were African, and we again maintained very strong links with the Asian community through my teaching practices. A third-year contract followed, again down at Ginger Senior Secondary School, and at this time, or by this time, I was actually chairman of the Amber Court Club. The chairmanship, again, reinforced quite a lot of those friendships that we had forged in the early days. Then came the time when I personally became involved in Amin's problems, or the problems that Amin created after '71. This became particularly apparent when he started to exterminate his so-called enemies in Ginger Barracks. Now, most of the African students who were at my school were based in and accommodated with friends in the Ginger Barracks. Many of them were targeted and indeed executed during the course of early 1971, and I was witness to many of those students actually going missing. Many of them had come to me and asked for the return of their caution money, and I arranged for them to receive that so they could go back to their villages. Unknown to me, this was to have serious consequences personally. At the end of that contract, when I went to Kampala to renew my contract and arrange my service home, I got the suspicion that all was not right, and I suspected that I was going to be allowed to leave the country and not return. On closer examination, the person came back into the office and said, "I'm terribly sorry, Colin, you're absolutely right. Because you were helping your students at this time, your card has been marked as helping agents or enemies of the state to escape. We're going to let you go home and your contract will not be renewed." I immediately arranged to have a 3-month extension of contract, and this is in April 1972, extension of contract in order to settle my affairs and particularly to arrange to sell those goods and household items that I wasn't going to bring home to the UK. That included my car, which that and quite a lot of the rest of my household goods we sold to our Asian friends. Who was to know that only 3 months later, Amin would make his announcement when all of these goods were absolutely worthless. You couldn't sell anything. At this time, I was fortunate, or we were fortunate, to be able to help some of our Asian friends. Because the amount of money and goods, the value was limited to what we could bring out, because I was on a fairly lowly teacher's salary, had some spare capacity. So we were able to help one particular family by taking their cash, topping up our allowance and bringing home cash for them. At the same time, they asked and we agreed to bring a lot of jewellery out for them, which my wife and my daughter wore around their arms and necks with what was at the time the fashion, high-necked and long-sleeved blouses, and we managed to get through customs without any problems. This was nothing compared to the sights we saw at Entebbe Airport as the Asians tried to leave and take out their goods. You can see at the side what I would call is a sanitized version of what we saw at the time. Piles and piles of luggage which had already been checked through customs but were now being vandalized by the army, torn open, goods strewn across the runway. And we had to worry certainly whether our own goods were going to be repatriated, but it was very clear that nothing was going to happen as far as the Asians were concerned. Fortunately, we got through customs okay, and we were able then to hand over jewellery that we had brought out back to our friends, and we remained in touch with those friends for a few months. It was difficult for even us to come back to this country at that particular time, 1972. If I can just refer to my notes a second. Readjusting to life back in the UK was difficult enough for my family. Metrication of sterling currency, the emergence of self-service shops, precursor to supermarkets, a vastly increased consumer choice were all unexpected but minor challenges. Add to these factors rampant inflation, high rates of unemployment, the miners' strike, the 3-day working week and regular power cuts, and this is saying nothing about the weather and the racialist abuse. I can only begin to imagine the bewilderment of our Asian friends who must have wondered what kind of hell they were coming back into. Finding employment in the UK for myself was difficult. It took me 6 months. But of course, that was nothing compared to the difficulties and problems that our friends experienced. When I moved out of the education service to set up my own company, as a management company, I made use of Margaret Thatcher's enterprise allowance. And my business plan had to be approved by a representative from the Department of Employment. As the day arrived and the representative appeared on my doorstep, imagine my surprise when it turned out to be one of my students from 1972 who was there to judge my business plan. Needless to say, my business plan was approved straight away. In 1981, having relocated the professional institute I was employed by to Melton Mowbray, which is why I'm now here in Leicester, imagine my surprise when I went into Syston, went into the bank to open an account, and lo and behold, the chief cashier was one of my old students. I walked into the local jewellers, again to be greeted by one of my old students. And this has gone on time and time again in shops and restaurants and other places around Leicester in the years that followed. I'm glad to say that now I have retired after a very successful career, and I've now begun to re-establish contact with a lot of Asian friends through the Lions Clubs International, through the University of the Third Age, the Syceman District Volunteer Centre that I do some work for, and I'm delighted to say that those links that we shared and the memories we now share about that wonderful country about which we were all so happy and so proud. And I'm so delighted to say that we number amongst our current friends and active friends. We play mahjong together, we play bowls together. We are very happily, again, working together. All I can say is, as far as the total experience is concerned, if again you will allow me to quote from here. Looking back, I can only commend the Asian communities for their success, not only in surviving those very serious early challenges, but through their industry, intelligence and family values, for rapidly developing into an essential part of our local and national economy and enriching our cultural landscape. If I had a hat, I'd raise it. All I can say at the moment is Sante Sana.
Hi everyone, my name is Sophie Canabar, previously known as Silpa Bendatani and also Shilpa Datani or Shilpa Canabar. So as you can see, I've had a bit of an identity journey and I'm happy to talk about it. My earliest recollection of Uganda, so as Rajat mentioned, I was 5 turning 6 and I remember being at the airport with my parents, looking at my mum, and my mum was 7 months pregnant with my baby sister, and just looking up and saying, "Mum, where are we going?" And as you can imagine, the airport was chaos, absolute chaos. And she looked down with a tear in her eye and she said, "I don't know. I honestly don't know." But she goes, "Don't worry, everything will be okay." And that memory, and I was clinging onto her sari and a murti, a jalara murti that I had in my hand. And I keep to this day because they are just profound in just reliving that and you know, the fear, the unknown, coming to England, it was just, it was so traumatic, and I can actually say it was a trauma. We were then housed into one of the camps, and then we were allocated a place to live in Ilkley in West Yorkshire, where we were the only family of colour, so we faced humongous amounts of racism. And my mother, throughout that, and my father, were so tough. And as Colin said, if anything, they've given us that resilience and strength. I've now carved a very successful career within the UK, and I have gorgeous children who are doing incredibly well. But I think there's a lot to be said on both continents, really. Africa gave us a home and threw us out. England gave us a home and didn't want us. So I think I'm still carrying on that journey and happy to take any questions about that whole experience from the audience. Thank you.
Mine really begins the Leicester end of the story, because I'd come to Leicester in the late 1960s as a student, and I'd come from suburban North London, and even before the arrival of those who were kicked out of Uganda, Leicester was an infinitely more interesting place than suburban North London. And it had diversity, not as great as it is today, but it had diversity that I found fascinating, and was, I think, pretty determined almost from the first year I got here to make my future here. And by the time of the news of what was happening in Uganda hit us, I'd already joined the Labour Party and I'd already got involved in a small way in the politics of the city. And then, of course, I was deeply ashamed of what some of the leaders of my own party here in the city did, because they put an advert in the Ugandan Argos saying, and you'll have all seen it, and many of you might have read it at the time, whatever you do, don't come to Leicester. Manzo Mogul, I think some of you will know, has always claimed it was gloriously counterproductive, because it produced people say, wow, there must be something in Leicester that's drawing people there, and perhaps we ought to be. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's an interesting version of it. But fortunately, it didn't stop people coming to Leicester, although, of course, they went many other places first in some cases, and eventually gravitated to Leicester, but some sooner rather than later. But of course, what they were met with here is incredibly mixed. I mean, it really is. Some enormous generosity of feeling. I mean, there really was. People talk to me, with enormous affection for the generosity that was shown to them, but they also remember their hatred that was there. I remember from those periods the NF letters, on walls of graffiti, a constant reminder. I remember that we had to set up an organisation called Unity Against Racism. It was all parties got involved in that, to their credit, including my own. But I got elected to the City Council actually the following year, in what was 73. And I'm proud of the fact that the new intake of councillors moved out of the leadership of the council, the people who were responsible for that advert. It's one of my sort of proudest political memories, really, looking back on that. And the leadership was replaced by somebody who will probably be remembered by somebody, Jim Marshall, who went on to be an MP and became leader of the council. And of course, what happened to Leicester, and perhaps we'll talk on this when we come to answer questions, was something very dramatic indeed. Because obviously people left with enormous anxieties, enormous suffering, enormous where are we going, who knows, and what lies ahead of us, who knows. But they brought very little, most of them at least, and the opportunity to get anything out of the country. If you perhaps had the good fortune and foresight perhaps to do that, but most hadn't. What they brought with them was in that baggage that they carried, and that was it. But what they brought, overwhelmingly, was ambition, was skills, particularly entrepreneurial skills, but not only entrepreneurial skills, entrepreneurial skills as well. And what they brought as well was a remarkable determination to engage into every aspect of the city's life. You know, if you can just think about the whole range of things in the city, you know, obviously from commerce and industry, you know, right the way through to civic life, politics, cultural life of the city, religious life of the city, all have been incredibly influenced for the better. And, you know, we've benefited enormously from it. And of course, again, perhaps in answer to questions, you know, some of the other things that the city's benefited from is the contribution that they've brought to the communities of Leicester and celebration of festivals in the city that are unparalleled outside of India. And you know, it's absolutely wonderful. So a lot of things to look back on with inevitable pain for those who are involved, some shame for what initially happened in Leicester, but enormous pride in what has been achieved as a result of all that was brought to, say, every aspect of the city's life. So that's my Leicester bit. I'm going to pass on now and no doubt come back to some questions later.
My name's Jasbir Singh. I'm one of the co-founders of South Asian Heritage Month. South Asian Heritage Month runs from the 18th of July to the 17th of August each year, and this is the third year that we have been having events. It's the first year that we've been having live events, in-person events. And when we were planning for South Asian Heritage Month 2022, the big anniversary that everyone was talking about was the 75th anniversary of the events of 1957, the creation of Pakistan, the independence of India, the partition of Punjab and Bengal. Very few people were talking about the 50th anniversary of the expulsion of Ugandan Asians. And it was something that we were very much aware of. My aunts were born in Uganda, although they left Uganda at the age of about 3 or thereabouts. So there was a personal connection to Uganda. And it felt important for us at South Asian Heritage Month to mark the anniversary, mark the 50th anniversary of the order being given by Idi Amin, the 50th anniversary, as we all know, being today. And also looking at the wider picture. What happened with the Ugandan Asians when they came to the UK? How were they treated? What were the responses? What was the reaction? But also, more importantly, the legacy. What can we see from today, looking into the past, and how can we use that to reflect towards the future? One of the themes the theme that we decided to go with for South Asian Heritage Month this year was Journeys of Empire. Journeys of Empire encompasses what happened 75 years ago in the subcontinent, but it also encompasses what happened 50 years ago. The expulsion of Ugandan Asians, that forced migration, is a story of empire. It's a journey of empire. And the fact that so many of the Ugandan Asians came to the UK and decided to settle here shows just how much that story continues. Now, we've heard Sophie talking about the trauma that was being felt at the time. I would go one step further and I'd say that there's a collective trauma that exists to this very day. And that collective trauma is amongst South Asians, not only for what happened 75 years ago, but amongst Ugandan Asians as to what happened 50 years ago. And that is part of the lived experience of being South Asian British. And that's why it's so important to have the work that's been done in Leicester, to hear the Leicester story, to hear about how the situation was when Colin came to the UK and left Uganda, and also the work that's been done by Jamie and others, the plays which are being put together, the artistic response, the cultural response, because that's going to be what lives with us after this anniversary has gone past. The final thought that I would like to leave you with before we move on would be this. When it comes to being South Asian or having that connection with South Asia, the lived experience is the important one, but it's also important to be authentic and to live that authenticity. and to be able to talk about our own experiences, historic, present, and in the future. And the fact that we're able to do that today is important, and the fact that we're able to do that 50 years to the day when the expulsion order was made is something that we should all be very proud of, that we can have this conversation, but let's remember that this is something that will need to continue for some time to come. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name's Chandni Mistry and I work here at Curve Theatre. I am also an actor, but for this I have written one of the 3 plays. So hopefully tonight a lot of you will be sticking around to watch the Finding Home plays that are on this evening. We've got 90 Days, which is written by Ashok Patel, and the writer is right there, so give us a wave, Ashok. And some of the cast are up there too, I can see them. And then we've got Call Me By My Name, which is written by Dylan Raitata, who's not here, but has been inspired actually by, all the plays have been inspired by the community and especially Sophie. So it's lovely to see you again. So I just want to talk very quickly about why we've chosen to do this at Curve. So back in December they put a call out to say we want some writers who've got some lived experience or some experience of, you know, Ugandan Asian Exodus or some link to it. Would you like to write some plays? And the 3 of us got the job, so that was exciting. And we decided that 2 of the plays would be a show for adults, so you guys, so that's the ones that you'll be watching hopefully tonight. And I have a real interest in family theatre, so theatre that you can bring your 70-year-old grandma to, but also your 6-year-old granddaughter to. And I think that's so important. So I decided to write a show for families. So my show's on only on the weekends. And it's a way for us to educate the next generation because it's so important. We're sitting here today, and my dad's over there, hello Dad, and he's from Ginger, and he left, and we went back a few years ago, and we went and had a look, and as he was showing me and telling me things, I couldn't believe that I'm now 35 and I didn't know half of those things that he was telling me. That, you know, my grandma sat there and cooked cassava chips on the corner to the school kids that probably went to your school, Colin. You know, so it's those stories that we wanted to show in these performances. So we led some chai and chat sessions with our director Mandy and the writers. We went out and we met, hopefully some of you guys, we met Sophie anyway, and we found out the stories. And I'm going to be honest with you, it wasn't easy because everyone likes to talk about the mango trees and how hot the weather was and how lovely it was and how we did nothing wrong and we just got kicked out. And it took a long time, a lot of digestive biscuits and a lot of tea with some of those uncles and aunties to really get the deeper stories. What was actually going on? What were the nitty-gritties that people don't want to talk about today? So when you watch the performances tonight, and if you come back and watch Ruka on the weekend, I hope you see that we have tried to show a little bit more than the usual side of the story, and we are trying to talk to people and get the other side of the story as well. And finally, I'd just like to say, if you haven't been to Curve before, then welcome, because it's so nice to have you guys in this theatre. You know, this is what we want. This is meant to be a community space, so we've got the community in. The cast of the show are all the community, so if we do another community performance and you want to act, then, you know, make sure you get in touch with me in the future. There'll be some singing outside from the Man from Africa. I've got the Chili guys out at the front. We've got our exhibition up at the top. So I hope that you enjoy your evening here today because we want Curve to feel like it's for you and that you feel very much part of this, this space. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll be speaking to Colin in a few moments, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions to our panellists, our guests. So put your thinking caps on because I'm sure you've got lots of questions that you might want to ask. Colin, I'd just like to ask you, because as you said, you're in quite a unique situation really, and unique in the fact that you are probably one of the few people in this room who'd actually met Idi Amin. What was he like?
Oh, big.
6'4", I understand, wasn't he? And a boxer. He was a heavyweight champion, wasn't he?
He was, yes, and 6'4", that was around the waist. You know, the only time I ever came into contact with him was, I think it was at that time called the Imperial Hotel, In the swimming pool there, I was there one day and suddenly this army entourage arrived and this big guy in his stripped off and dived in, and I was gently urged to come out of the pool while he finished his lengths.
And he made a splash, I take it.
He did indeed. He had the grace at the end of his 2 lengths to come and shake my hand, but said absolutely nothing and then wandered off. But that's my claim to fame. Yes.
I've seen some incredible footage of Idi Amin because, as you say, he was a keen swimmer, and he would often swim in the Sheraton pool at the Sheraton Hotel. And sometimes he would swim against some champions, some leading champions. But funny enough, he would always win. So I'm not surprised about that. But you also talked about some of the horrific things that you saw, you witnessed as you described the exterminations. When people think about what happened in Uganda, we often hear about what happened to Asians, but it wasn't just Asians, it was black Africans as well. If you were part of the wrong tribe, then you too would be targeted, and you saw that firsthand at your school.
Absolutely. I said that I was asked for caution money to be returned. The one particular day, I was faced with 30 students who were pleading to have their caution money returned. Caution money being a 30 shillings deposit they put at the beginning of their school career, which we held in case they did any damage or kept any textbooks, but it was kept on deposit for them. I said, I don't have that amount of money on the premises at the moment, come back this afternoon. When they came back this afternoon, only 3 of them were left alive. 3 of them then we had to take, 2 of them we took home in the back of my car, and they hid in my garage until night and then disappeared, and the other one decided to go off by himself. But that was actually stone cold hard up against the terror that was going on at the time. Their only crime was they belonged to the wrong tribe. Simple as that.
And you mentioned the terror, I mentioned the bloodshed, the panic, the chaos that was felt by a lot of Asians, for tens of thousands of Asians, because there were around 70,000 to 80,000 Asians living in Uganda at the time. Tell us what it was like, though, for non-Asians, for white Europeans who were living in Uganda.
Strangely enough, we lived in a sort of unreal world. There was no animosity at all towards us as the European expatriate population, or indeed against those who had actually taken up Ugandan citizenship. We were, if you like, we rode above it. I think my wife mentioned in conversation earlier that regularly she was stopped in her car by a roadblock going across the Owen Falls Dam to get from our home to Naito factory, stopped by a roadblock because they were throwing bodies off the dam into the water, African bodies, of course, mainly. But in being stopped, there was no animosity towards us, there was no threat towards the European population. We were, as it were, regarded as somehow privileged in that sense, and we were able to override or ride across. Now, the next question to arise is, why did we not get very angry or disturbed at what we were viewing? Unfortunately, at the time, it's not something I'm proud of, it was something we took as a view was, that's their problem, not ours. If we were to get involved, perhaps we would be threatened, so we tended to stay on the outside of it. I'm not proud of that, but that's the reality of the situation.
That's the reality. And Sophie, I know you were very young, as you said, 5 or 6 when you came here. But what are your memories of the time? And I can remember you telling me about a situation where you were hiding at one point under the bed. Just tell us about that and what effect it's had on you to this day.
So my memories are quite. They're very vivid. Unfortunately, I don't, I can recall certain things. And I remember asking my father, Dad, were they soldiers? And he said, yeah, but they were fine. And we know they weren't fine. From all the history that we've read about and heard about, those soldiers weren't fine. I've been following a journey that my sister's been telling me about where the soldiers were around, they were stealing, they were raping, they were causing all sorts of violence. And my sister recalled a memory where she was being chased by soldiers after leaving school, and my father had gone with his friend in his car to find her. And, you know, there must be a God up there looking out for our family, because she was fortunate enough to be found and brought home safely, and then hidden in panels within cupboards so that they wouldn't be found. And she was reflecting how my mum would hide the three of us in these panels so that the soldiers wouldn't come and take the children. It's just horrific. And, you know, for me, the saddest part, I've lost both my parents, and they never once talked about it. I think the trauma was just so intense and so immense that they just couldn't bring themselves to talk about it. They almost, you know, covered it up and said everything was fine. I think I've watched the plays already, and I look at the plays, and I've been educated. I've learned things about how the black Ugandans are feeling, how perhaps we weren't fair towards them. Although my father always said that the people that worked for him or worked within our household, they were like family. You know, we all ate together, we all washed together, we all cleaned together. But I don't think that was the same everywhere. For me, it's just sad that I didn't talk to my parents or didn't push them enough to get their stories, because they've both passed away, and I have just miniature stories from them. And it's horrific when I hear some stories that Colin said and some of the ones that I've been educated on. It's horrific.
And you mentioned the trauma, and I think that there are a lot of people to this day from Uganda who are suffering, who are still coping with the trauma, with the mental anguish. I interviewed a woman just a few weeks ago whose husband was kidnapped 50 years ago, and to this day she is still wondering what happened to him. She doesn't know what happened, and she still, although she knows the reality is that he's not alive, she still clings on to the hope. That itself must be so heartbreaking, not knowing what has happened. Do you think, Sophie, the fact that as Asians we tend not to talk about what happened, does that make it worse, because there is no way to vent what happened? There is no way to, there isn't a cathartic process, is there? Do you think that makes it harder?
Absolutely. I think as Asians we have this tough exterior that nothing affects us, and we'll just carry on, and we're resilient and we're strong, and, you know, we'll just carry on. It's not healthy. You know, I've had a huge identity crisis of whether, you know, I'm Asian, I'm Western, I'm Eastern, you know, and there's parts of our culture that I absolutely adore, and there's parts of our culture that I'm quite embarrassed of, and there's parts of the Western culture that I adore, and again, parts of that, like the National Front, that I'm not so proud of. So I think as Asians, we really need to deal with trauma and talk about our trauma. It's so important. And I think to the dying day when my father passed away, I said, can you tell me any of the stories? And he wouldn't. He just said, no, let's move on, let's forget that. It's not healthy. And I think I've done a couple of sessions with yourself, Rajiv, in the schools, and I just think it's really important that we acknowledge trauma, and the trauma of leaving Uganda and the trauma of trying to re-establish a home in the UK. They're both different types of trauma, and for me this has been very therapeutic, just doing these stories and talking to people. But when I've listened to you guys talking to people, and Janni and the members of her team, it's been hugely important to do it, and, you know, to mark this moment in history. So anybody out there who hasn't talked to their family or hasn't sought help, please do, because we had to deal with a lot. And don't just take it for granted, because it lives with you, and it burns inside. And, you know, there's still parts of it that will well up inside me, and I write and I talk and I tell people about it. So for all those elders that are still around, please get their stories.
Really important. And approximately 5 weeks after Idi Amin made that announcement, the first flight from Uganda arrived at Stansted Airport. That was on the 18th of September. So, Peter, we know that many people came to Leicester. Around 28,000 people came to the UK. A large number moved to Leicester. The City Council, now you've been the City Mayor for many years, and the City Council has done a fantastic job in terms of welcoming people from all walks of life, all countries, all corners of the globe. But it was different then, wasn't it, 50 years ago? I know that you worked hard to fight against that. You weren't part of the local authority that placed that advert in the Ugandan newspaper. Why do you think that advert was placed?
Difficult question to answer. The reasons that were given in the advert may have motivated some of them. That social services, education, housing were under pressure in the city. And it may well be that some of those who were motivated by that just wanted to try to minimise the extent to which further pressure was put on the city. I say very short-sighted, very angry about it, that perhaps from their limited perception of what was coming and what they could do and how the city could benefit, they thought they were doing the right thing. But I say that doesn't make it forgivable. I just tried to explain it.
I think it was quite a short-sighted approach, wasn't it? Because I think nationally, it wasn't just in Leicester, across the country, there was a feeling that the influx, the Asians that came to Britain, that would come to Britain, would be a burden on the state. But that couldn't have been further from the truth, because Asians actually went on to contribute massively to the local and national economy, as you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Every aspect of the city's life has benefited enormously from those who did choose to come to Leicester and to ignore the advert, or perhaps by the advert to think it was a good place to come to. But I think the fact is that it was a dreadful thing to do, but, and it is a big but, for many who did come, they will remember kindness and warmth in the welcome. They will also remember the vicious, nasty, hateful doctrines of the DNF and some parts of the city where they wouldn't venture, but certainly wouldn't let the kids venture out to some parts of the city in those early years. And I think it's a mixed memory really of some very good and some appalling behaviour from Leicester people. Now looking back on it, we can perhaps gloss over some of those less good parts of it. But I think obviously what the city has got from it is just so enormously positive that perhaps it's easy to forget just how difficult it was for the people and what a trying time it was for those of us who are seeking to fight racism in the city.
Very much so, and you alluded to the fact that possibly the City Council made an own goal at the time, because a lot of people actually came to Leicester as a result.
Yeah, I mean, whether it really was the result, I don't know, but they did come to Leicester, and Leicester benefited enormously from the fact that they did. And, as I say, the one bit that I'm personally proud of is that within less than 12 months of that advert appearing, the leadership of the council was dramatically changed, and the new generation took their place. But it was interesting, when you see the pictures of the delegation that went down to see the Home Secretary, to try and persuade the Home Secretary to get the Uganda Resettlement Board to tell people to go somewhere other than Leicester. You do see it was all the political parties on the City Council were there together and felt that somehow they were putting up a common front, and sadly my own party was a part of it.
And Sir Peter, looking back at what happened 50 years ago and the council's stance at the time, what can we learn from what happened and the stance of then? What can we learn now? Because we've seen what's happening in places like Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan.
One of the most significant things, I think, was that those who came, say, with very little by way of personal goods, but did come with full civic rights and took advantage of that. They became engaged in the life of the city, and the democratic life of the city most particularly. It was only a matter of very few years before the City Council had amongst its number a very significant number of those who had Uganda or elsewhere in East Africa as their immediate origins. And of course we saw Gordon Palmer elected as the Lord Mayor within, I don't know, 10, 12 years, I can't remember quite how long it was, but it wasn't very long. And there were others there, and it was that engagement in the life of the city. And I think that it's a lesson for us with others who choose to make their lives in Leicester and for other towns and cities. That enabling engagement in all aspects of our life, particularly in its civic governance, is something that makes or takes advantage of what they have to offer, but also make sure they're fully engaged in the life of the city in a way that was possible with the Ugandan Asians and those others who came from East Africa.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I did say there would be some questions from the audience. So, does anybody have any questions for any of our guests? I've got lots of questions, but we would like to throw it open. Just raise your hand. Would anybody? Yes, at the back there.
When we arrived here, one of the things I remember my dad saying to my mum is, "We escaped Idi Amin's curfew. Will we escape the curfew in Leicester?" Because we couldn't even go out. The clock tower was full of skinheads. We couldn't go out on our own. We had to go out in twos.
Yeah, I've acknowledged that the experience of those who arrived in Leicester was sometimes they felt very warmly welcomed, but often found an atmosphere that was very hostile to them. And I think that there were some things that the council did that helped with that. Some things that I think were less effective. But I do think that the way in which so many became engaged in the organisation I mentioned earlier, Unity Against Racism, which came from a wide range of political backgrounds, was a reflection of the fact that the sort of experience you're talking about was still far too common and far too widely experienced. I think we've come a long way, but even today I'm not complacent about it.
Okay, we'd like to get some more questions in. First of all, Rupal, you've got a question there.
This question to Peter. I know that you weren't responsible, or your party wasn't responsible for the advert, but on this 50th anniversary, is it something you would consider doing, issuing an apology to Ugandan Asians in Leicester?
It's not a personal apology, but it's an apology on behalf of those who went before me. They should never have done it. I've said that so many times over the years. All I can say in mitigation is that we removed them from power very shortly afterwards. But that doesn't alter the fact that it should never have happened in the first place.
Question, Colin, Idi Amin was obviously welcome, in fact, when he became president. After the coup, he was welcomed by all the Christians. Just give a reflection on what that was about and what turned him against the community that had welcomed him so much.
African politics is very difficult to get a grasp of. It is, or was, and I believe still is, very tribally orientated. Obote by 1971 had produced something called the Common Man's Charter. And in that Common Man's Charter, he made it very, very clear that there was to be an aggressive program of nationalisation and Africanisation. The alarm bells were already ringing at that time for those who were not of African origin. Once the coup took place, Obote was already fairly unpopular, certainly amongst the southern tribes, the Baganda and those who were the Basoga, the Baganda, etc. He was already pretty unpopular. So when he was overthrown, the southern states particularly were overjoyed. And of course they were joined by those of the Kakwa up in the northwest because that was his tribe. So there was a sort of unification initially for the change of government and the potential for the aims and objectives of the Common Man's Charter perhaps to be put to one side. That being the case, then the Asian and the European community also sort of breathed a sigh of relief because they were watching what had been going on over in Kenya and in Tanzania, where Africanization was already going on at a great pace and people were being not ejected from the country but finding themselves unemployed and given no option but to decide to leave, which is a slightly different scenario. But it's true to say, I think, after the overthrow, Amin was popular, but very, very quickly into 1972, on the incidences I was, early 71, sorry, in the incidents I was talking about, his cleansing the army of factions which were antagonist towards him, the overthrow of local government officers, the public execution of mayors in the various towns. People very, very quickly became subdued and realized that protest was a very dangerous thing, and the whole thing sort of subsided. But initially, because of the relief from the Obote direction, Common Man's Charter, and the pleasure from the northern tribes who felt they were now going to be better represented, that represented and was shown as rejoicing for a change in government, but it proved to be short-lived and just a veneer on the whole of society.
Colin, thank you very much. You are an expert on Idi Amin.
On a more positive note, I worked in Belgrade, in a primary school in Belgrade, from 74 to 15 years, and I've got very positive memories of working with the communities there. We hadn't had any experience of working with those children before, but we bent over backwards to try to make sure that we valued the culture that they brought and everything of them. So, you know, those very, very positive memories, I hope, are reflected in people's memories if you were there at the time.
And there were many positive memories from the local community and people that were here before the expulsion. There was a lady that in the audience today, Breteva Ben Kataria. She was here in 1970, and so 2 years before the expulsion. And she lived in a two-bedroom house just off Belgrave Road, off Loughborough Road, Shirley Street. At the time of the expulsion, 40 members of her family in Uganda said, I want to come and stay with you, because we know a lot of people stayed in resettlement camps. And she, because she's a lovely, hospitable woman, she said yes. So she had 40 relatives staying in her two-bedroom house with one bathroom. Can you imagine in those days? And everything was fine. But one of the neighbours complained. The council went round thinking, what's going on? You know, we've got a slum landlord. And when they went in, they saw everyone was happy, they were being fed, and in fact they ended up praising Breteva Ben for doing a fantastic job, and they offered help. So there was a lot of good spirit at the time as well. Any more questions? Yes, the gentleman with the glasses, yes.
I've had the privilege over the past few months of working with NAVRAM to create the Building Lives exhibition and Blue Wharf. And what struck me, I was born in 1976. I grew up with the people around me here, and me and my friends, we never knew this story. Whether it's because those parents didn't talk to their children, and so on and so forth. And so I've been fortunate to spread this work, but it appears to me that there are whole swathes of this city who are aged below the age of 50, who don't necessarily understand because they're not from that community. So how do we go about making this not a South Asian Heritage Month story or an Asian history story? This is a British story. This is British history. This is Leicester's history. How do we make it much more widely understood and known? Okay, if Jasmine would like to answer that, and as I say, if we can keep it brief, then we can get maybe one or two questions in, because we're approaching, we've just got a couple of minutes left now.
So, South Asian Heritage Month is about British identity. It's about being British. The story of what happened in Uganda, the Ugandan Asians coming over 50 years ago, that's part of British history. And South Asian Heritage Month is here to promote that understanding of whatever's happened in, say, as I was saying earlier, 1947 in India, Pakistan, that's British history. What happened 50 years ago in Uganda, that's British history. Ideally, I would like the month not to exist. And I look forward to the day when we don't need to have the month. But I look at Black History Month. That's been around for 35 years this year. That started in South London in 1987. That's not going anytime soon. And so I think South Asian Heritage Month will be here for a very long time, but we would like to have British history reflecting the diversity that exists in Britain, and for that to be taught in schools. Now, I was quite lucky. I'm from London, and in my school, my history teacher was Jewish. His parents had survived the Holocaust, and he was very much interested in making sure that people knew about their own histories and knew about their own authentic identities. And I think we need to have more of that in school, really.
I think the education side is really important, and my friend Ricky Vachuri and I, we are actually visiting schools across Leicestershire to raise awareness about what happened. I think we've got time for one final quick question. Alan, you had a question.
Well, I was just going to say, I was really sorry to hear what Sophie said about not feeling welcome. I mean, there were people like me out on the street protesting against the National Front. But I'm working as chair of BUA 50, and we're collecting some oral histories at the moment. And one of the main things we're doing is talking to some of those volunteers who came out at the time, who had never seen anyone of colour, but welcomed them. And I mean, I think there are some fantastic stories there. Personally, and we are in no way a political project, but I mean, I think the more that we talk about this story, and you're right, Jim, people don't know about the story, but the more we talk about it as a success story, and the way that people have contributed in such positive ways to British society, the better, as far as I'm concerned. And I think via our project, we will be doing that as much as we can.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. And thank you very much to our guests. I think they all deserve a big round of applause. I'd also like to thank you for coming along today. Thank you.